I know exactly how much it annoys you when someone brings out their queen early or tries to checkmate you with a scholar's mate. Today, once and for all, I'm going to show and explain to you how to punish your opponent for this. Plus, we'll go over a few popular traps that are also based on an early queen sortie, and I'll show you how to refute them. Let's go! I've already covered on the channel how to play as black if someone tries to checkmate you with the fool's mate, and I'll link it. If you haven't seen it, be sure to check it out. But now we're going to look at it from white's perspective. After the moves e4, e5, knight to f3, there are some really annoying continuations from black. It's either the move bishop to c5, which seems to give up the pawn on a5, but for some reason many people are afraid to take it, or the move queen to f6. Why am I bringing this up? Because against my students, at levels below 1000, a lot of people play this way and they have no idea what to do. So, if your opponent brings the bishop out to c5, of course that's a serious mistake, and we immediately take the pawn on a5, not giving the opponent any time to recover, yes. So of course he's trying to distract our knight in order to bring out his queen, but we're actually happy about that, because if the queen comes out to f6, we have the move d4, we defend the knight and attack the bishop at the same time, and then we just keep developing our pieces with an extra pawn. But if the queen comes out to h4, which scares many people because of the double attack on both the f2 and e4 pawns, we still continue to develop logically, namely by occupying the center. We don't need to try to defend everything and everyone, although you could try to do that with the move queen to f3. The strongest move is d4, because if the opponent takes the pawn on e4 with check, we block with the bishop on e3. Black, for example, moves the bishop anywhere, and we develop the knight to d2. You know very well that bringing out the queen early in the game is bad precisely because the queen comes under a huge number of tempo moves and attacks, which allows us to gain a significant lead in development. So don't be afraid if the queen invades your side early in the game. On the contrary, you should be glad because you'll have the chance to punish your opponent for it. Well, for example, after the move queen to f5, try to guess the next move. It's bishop to c4. Of course, we're simply developing our pieces. We now have 4 minor pieces developed, and the pawn on f7 is under attack. It's not clear at all how the opponent is supposed to defend it, and for example, if the opponent plays the knight to a6, we can even capture the knight. There's an even harsher move, g4, because the queen has very few squares left, and after queen to f6, we play pawn to g5. In other words, we have a completely winning position. So if you see the move bishop to c5, which is actually a pretty popular choice, with 31 million games on Lichess, you should definitely take that pawn on e5, even though many people are afraid to do it. Now let's move on to what to do if your opponent brings out the queen to f6 on the second move. I also know very well that this really annoys a lot of people. Many people don't know how to respond to this and try to punish it immediately somehow, and often nothing good comes out of it. There's no need to rush forward, you just need to keep developing your knight with the idea of placing it on d5. Here, I've looked at the 3 most popular continuations for black: c6, knight to c6, and bishop to c5. But let's get right to it. If black prevents us from placing our knight on d5, what should we do then? In that case, we take control of the center, open up our dark squared bishop, and after the pawn is taken on d4, we bring the bishop out to g5, yes. And for example, if the queen moves to g6, then we capture on d4 with our queen. And after that, well, for example, if the bishop is attacked, we retreat, threatening the move knight to e5, then the bishop comes out to c4. We castle long, and you have a huge lead in development. Because if black, for example, develops the knight after knight to f5, where should the queen go? To h7 or to h5? Well, then you bring the bishop to c4, and everything will be great. If the queen retreats to d6, that's not a problem either. We capture with the knight, and we don't trade queens. On the contrary, we actually want the opponent's queen to stay on the board so we can keep attacking it and gain tempo. Queen to d2, and then we castle long. In my opinion, it's a fantastic position where all your pieces are active and you're already starting to plan an attack on your opponent's king side. Overall, there's really nothing to worry about here. If after the move, d4 black tries to somehow defend the pawn on e5, we can simply play bishop to g5 and win that pawn later, because if the queen moves here or here, we just take it. And taking on e5 is impossible because the opponent gets checkmated on d8. So, on the contrary, you should actually be glad if you see your opponent's queen coming out early. Just keep your composure and be ready to gradually punish them for it. There's no need to try to win in 1 or 2 moves. If the bishop comes out to c5, then we play knight to d5. As I already mentioned, our knight comes out here to create problems for the opponent and to attack the queen. If the queen retreats to d8, we take the pawn on e5 and then play d4. We simply have an extra pawn for nothing. If the opponent moves the queen to d6, that basically loses the game immediately. We play d4, and after the bishop retreats, we capture the pawn on e5 with the knight, and you have extra material. If they capture on d4 with the pawn, then after bishop to f4, we attack the queen. And after the queen moves somewhere, we fork on c7 and win the rook. In other words, we win the game. It's pretty much the same story if, instead of the bishop going to c5, the knight comes out to c6. Then we immediately play d4, the opponent captures, and after that we play the knight to d5. On queen to d6, we bring the bishop out to f4. If the queen retreats to d8, then we take the pawn, take, and after that our task is to develop bishop to a3 and castle long. There's also an unpleasant threat for the opponent, queen to a5. For example, if black plays c6, we play queen to e5, and after they cover with something, there's a fork threat on c7. If they play knight f6, it's the same thing. We play queen to a5 and then capture the pawn on c7, giving the opponent a fork. That's why they need to play d6 to prevent the queen from getting there. Well, we've developed the bishop to f4 and castled long. We have a huge lead in development. Now we'll bring out the light-squared bishop, bring the rook over, play e5, and break through black's position. So don't be afraid if your opponent brings out their queen early in the game. Now let's look at a few traps where your opponent's queen can also suddenly appear in your camp. Moving on, there's a so-called popular trap for black when we develop the knight to f3, the bishop to c4, and then comes the move knight to d4. This trap is called the tasty pawn. I think many people already know about this, that for example you can't take the pawn on e5 because black brings out their queen to g5, we take the pawn on f7, black takes on g2, and basically with just the queen, they beat us. How do you fight against this? You shouldn't touch that pawn. We capture the knight on d4, the opponent recaptures, and we castle. Now queen sorties don't bother us at all here, and we can gain a huge lead in development. For example, if the opponent continues with bishop to c5, then in that case we can strike with bishop to f7, a move many people don't know about, and after king takes on f7, play queen to h5, delivering a double attack on the king and the bishop, gaining a huge advantage right from the start of the game. If instead of playing bishop to c5, black plays knight to f6, then in that case we can simply play rook to e1, support the pawn on e4, and still go for c3 to develop our pieces as quickly as possible. For example, after a move like bishop to c5, we can already play e5, yes, if we are not prevented, and the knight will have to retreat, after which queen to g4 is a good move to attack the pawn on g7 and force the king to move to f8. The only thing is now we need to be careful not to overlook the move d5 with the discovered attack, for example, by moving the queen to f3, but I'm just showing approximate variations. It's not a fact that everything will go exactly like this. Also here it's quite common to play d6, the most popular move for black. But in that case, we play c3, undermining this pawn, then capture with the knight, and you can see just how huge the development advantage is for white right now. And here you can simply play d4, seizing space, but the most aggressive move is queen to b3, putting pressure on the f7 pawn. It's not possible to develop the bishop, you simply lose material there. If, for example, black defends with the queen to a 7, then we already play d4. And now the question arises, how should black develop their dark-squared bishop? And after a move like g6, we simply bring our bishop out to g5 and then play e5. If you have a lead in development, you need to try to open up the center as quickly as possible and break through your opponent's defense. That's exactly what works here, because after the captures, the knight is pinned, and after queen to c5, the move rook to e1 wins. Let me go over another popular position. This is the Friedliver attack. Many white players love this line. Let me show again how it arises. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. Here, there's the move bishop to c5, after which there are also many interesting continuations. There's the move knight to f6, and the most popular reply on Lichess is knight to g5. Everyone really loves the Friedliver attack. And here, black has the correct move d5, but there are other interesting continuations as well. But one of the traps is connected with the move knight to e4. Because if you capture the knight, then black plays d5, delivering a double attack, and everything is fine for them. In fact, their position is simply better after that. If you capture the pawn on f7 with the knight, forking the queen and the rook, then black can bring the queen out to h4. And this position is very unpleasant because there is an attack on f2. If you play g3, then comes the blow knight to g3, and then queen to a4, check. Well, even if we, for example, castle, there's still knight to f2, and the bishop comes out to c5. I won't go into too much detail right now, but I'll just say that this is a very bad position for white. So, how do you punish this trap? The move is knight to f4. In this case, you should simply capture on f7 with the bishop. This is only the third most popular move. The black king has to move to e7, and here it's important for us to play pawn to d4. The idea is to quickly open up our dark squared bishop. If black captures, then with a discovered attack we win the queen. If black plays something like h6, we can simply take the knight. King to f7, d5, and the opponent has no castling rights. Now we'll finish our development, and again, try to open up the position to get to the opponent's king. Also, after the move knight to e7, the move d6 looks interesting, for example. If they capture with the knight on d4, there's also the option of taking the pawn on d4, but in that case we simply move the bishop to d5, attack the other knight, and yes, it can't be captured. If the knight moves to f6, then queen to e2 is practically checkmate. Yes, queen to e2 check, king to d6, knight to f7. At the very least there's a fork, and there's bishop to f4. Check, with possible mating threats. So opening up the king is simply a death sentence. They have to capture with the knight. We play pawn to c3, driving the knight back. So, the pawn was sacrificed once again to open up even more lines. We move the bishop to d5, also attacking the knight. If the knight goes to f6, then we set up a fork. If the knight goes to d6, then in that case we have the move knight to e6. We attack the queen. If the queen retreats to e8, we simply develop the bishop to g5, king to f7, knight to c7, and we win it thanks to the discovered check. And if they capture the knight, then bishop to g5, and we have a skewer and an open. Well, that is extra material right from the start of the game. Now you know what to do if your opponent brings out the queen early in the game. Plus, you know how to effectively respond to some of the commonly popular traps from black. If you like this kind of content and want to see more breakdowns on how to deal with annoying lines from your opponents, write those lines in the comments and I'll definitely analyze them in the future.